If you're 45 and you haven't hit a specific number yet, I need to tell you the truth. The version of retirement planning built for 25-year-olds does not apply to you anymore. And pretending it does is the exact thing that turns a comfortable retirement at 65 into a forced, underfunded one at 71. This isn't about panic, it's about knowing exactly what has to be true by the end of this year, so you don't find out the hard way at 63 that the runway got away from you. I'm Clara Morgan, and on this channel we take the confusing, jargon-heavy side of money and translate it into plain math you can actually use. Today, I want to walk you through the real milestones that matter at 45, not the generic save more advice you've already heard 100 times, but the specific checkpoints that actually predict whether you retire on time or retire late. Let's start with something a lot of retirement researchers look at, your savings to income ratio. Some retirement economists who study this for a living use a rough benchmark of having somewhere around 3 to 4 times your annual income saved by 45. So let's figure out what that means in real life. If you make $70,000 a year, that's roughly $210,000 to $280,000 across your retirement accounts. Not your house, not your emergency fund, just retirement money. Say that number out loud, and it can feel scary if you're not there yet. But here's the reassuring part. This is a checkpoint, not a verdict. It tells you where to focus, not whether you've already failed. Researchers who build these age-based benchmarks aren't handing down a grade, they're handing you a map. And a map only works once you know where you're actually standing on it. Most people never check, which means they spend their 40s either falsely reassured or needlessly panicked when a single honest look at this one number would have told them the truth either way. And there's still a real question sitting underneath that number that we haven't answered yet. What happens to the people who are behind on it? Here's the next milestone, and it's one almost nobody talks about correctly: your compounding runway. At 45, you still have 20 years until a typical 65 retirement age. 20 years of compounding is not a small amount of time. It's actually one of the last windows where growth can do more of the work than your own contributions. Let's do the math together. If you put $500 a month into an account growing at a conservative long-term average, by 65, that becomes a meaningfully larger number than the total you actually put in, because the growth compounds on itself year after year. The catch is that this window is closing, not open forever. Every year you wait past 45 shrinks that compounding runway a little more. So the real milestone isn't, have I saved enough? It's, have I protected the years I have left? Next milestone, the IRS catch-up contribution rule. And this one is genuinely good news. Starting at 50, you're allowed to put more into your 401k and IRA than younger workers can, specifically because the government recognizes that people in their late 40s and 50s often need to accelerate. At 45, you're 5 years away from unlocking that extra room. So one of your milestones this year should simply be getting your accounts and your budget positioned so that when that catch-up window opens, you're ready to use every bit of it, instead of finding out about it at 52 and losing 2 years you could have used it. Now, let's talk about debt, because this milestone gets ignored constantly. By 45, you want a real, written-down target date for when your mortgage and any other major debt will be paid off. And ideally, that date lands before your planned retirement age, not after. Here's why the math matters so much here. Every dollar you're still sending to a mortgage payment at 66 is a dollar your retirement savings has to cover on top of everything else. A retirement that's debt-free costs dramatically less per month to sustain than one that isn't. So the milestone isn't just make progress on debt, it's know your exact payoff date and check whether it lines up with your retirement date. Because if it doesn't, that's a gap you need to close now, not later. There's a healthcare milestone here too, and it's one that quietly determines a huge chunk of your retirement budget. If you have access to a health savings account, 45 is a critical age to maximize it because an HSA is one of the only accounts with a genuine triple tax advantage. Money goes in without being taxed, it grows without being taxed, and it comes out without being taxed when used for medical expenses. Let's make that concrete. If you consistently max out an HSA from 45 to 65, you're not just saving on today's medical bills, you're building a dedicated fund for the exact expense category that tends to blindside retirees the hardest. And here's the part almost nobody mentions. Unused HSA funds don't expire, they just keep compounding, which means this milestone is really about starting the clock as early as possible, and 45, with 20 years left, is still early enough to matter enormously. There's also an investment allocation milestone that tends to get skipped entirely, and it matters more at 45 than it did at 25. When you're younger, the advice is simple. Stay aggressive. Ride out the swings. Time is on your side. At 45, that advice needs a second look, not because you should suddenly play it safe, but because you still have 20 years, which is genuinely long enough to stay meaningfully invested in growth-oriented assets, just not so long that you can ignore the mix entirely and hope it sorts itself out. Let's make this concrete. If your entire retirement account is sitting in the same allocation you picked at 28 and you've never looked at it since, that's not a strategy, that's an accident. The milestone here is simple. By 45, actually open the account and check what you're invested in, confirm it still matches a 20-year time horizon, and adjust if it's drifted into something either too cautious to grow or too aggressive to survive a bad 5 years right before you need the money. This is one of those checkpoints that costs you nothing to check and can cost you years of retirement if you never look. And there's one more that ties everything together. How long you're actually planning for. A lot of retirement math still gets built around living to somewhere in your late 70s or early 80s, because that used to be the reasonable assumption. It isn't anymore. If you're 45 today, there's a real chance you're planning for a retirement that needs to stretch 25 to 30 years, not 15. Here's why that number matters so much. A retirement plan built for 15 years and a retirement plan built for 30 years are not the same plan with a different ending date. They require fundamentally different savings rates along the way. So the milestone at 45 is to stop planning for the retirement your parents had and start planning for the longer one that's actually more likely for you. Because underestimating how long you'll need this money to last is one of the quietest ways a retirement plan fails. One more unanswered thread before we move forward. All 7 of these checkpoints assume you're starting from some kind of baseline. But what if you're not close to any of them yet? What if 45 already feels like it arrived without any of this in place? That's exactly the question I want to answer next, because the honest answer is not what most people expect. One more milestone before we get to the part that actually matters most, your Social Security estimate. By 45, you should have actually pulled your Social Security statement and looked at your projected benefit. Because the difference between claiming at 62 versus waiting until 67 or 70 is not a small rounding error. It's often a difference of hundreds of dollars a month for the rest of your life. This is math you can start planning around right now, 20 years before you'd ever claim it. And that early planning is exactly what turns Social Security from a guess into a real, reliable piece of your retirement puzzle, instead of a number you'll only find out for certain the year you actually retire. So that's 7 checkpoints so far. The savings ratio, the compounding runway, the catch-up window, the debt payoff date, the HSA, your investment allocation, and how long your money actually needs to last. Plus your Social Security estimate makes 8. But here's the honest question underneath all of it, the one I promised to answer. What actually happens if you're behind on some of these right now? Let me walk you through 2 people, both 45, both making the same income, because this is where the stakes become real instead of abstract. The first person looks at this list, feels overwhelmed, and decides to revisit it later, maybe when things feel less tight. The second person doesn't have more money than the first person. She doesn't get a raise or an inheritance. She just does three specific things this year. She increases her contribution rate by 2%. She sets an actual mortgage payoff date on the calendar instead of a vague hope. And she opens the HSA she'd been meaning to open for 3 years. By the math, that 2% contribution increase alone, held for 20 years of growth, can add tens of thousands of dollars to her final balance simply because it started compounding 5 years earlier than if she'd waited until 50 to get serious. The mortgage date turns a fuzzy someday into a real number she can plan a retirement budget around. And the HSA, started at 45 instead of 55, has a full decade more of tax-free growth working in the background before she ever touches it. The first person isn't a failure, and I want to be really clear about that, because there's no villain in this story, just two different relationships with a 5-year window. But by 65, the math between these two people is not close, and the gap didn't come from luck or a bigger paycheck. It came from whether the checkpoints got addressed at 45 or ignored until later, when the same fixes cost more and buy less time. Here's the part that makes this worse than it needs to be. The first person almost always plans to catch up next year. And next year, life gets in the way again, the way it always does, and the checkpoint slides to 47, then 49, then suddenly it's 51, and the catch-up contribution window that was supposed to help is now trying to make up for 6 lost years instead of 1. This is the quiet mechanism behind almost every underfunded retirement I come across. Not one dramatic financial mistake, but a small, reasonable-sounding delay repeated enough times that the runway runs out before the plan does. Retirement researchers who study savings behavior have found something reassuring in all of this. People who make even modest course corrections in their mid-40s tend to close a meaningful portion of the gap by retirement because the years between 45 and 55 are still doing real compounding work, even if they don't feel as dramatic as starting at 25. The point isn't that 25 didn't matter. It's that 45 still matters enormously, and treating it like it's too late is the actual mistake, not the years you can't get back. If anything, the data on midlife course correction should be the most reassuring part of this entire video, because it means the outcome isn't locked in yet. It's still being written one decision at a time. And you're not reading this after the window closed. You're reading it while it's still wide open. So let's turn this into something you can actually use this week. And I want to walk through each one with the actual action attached, not just the concept. First, pull your real numbers, your current retirement balance and your annual income. Then compare that against the 3 to 4 times benchmark we talked about earlier. This isn't about judging yourself against it. It's about knowing exactly where the starting line is, because you can't close a gap you haven't measured. Second, check your compounding runway. Log into your retirement account and just look, honestly, at how it's grown over the last 5 years, because that tells you what your money is actually capable of doing over the next 20, and it usually reframes urgency in a useful way. Third, mark your calendar for the year you turn 50 and set a real reminder, not a mental note, so you're ready to increase your contributions the moment catch-up eligibility opens, instead of finding out about it 2 years late. Fourth, write down an actual mortgage payoff date. In writing, somewhere you'll see it, and hold yourself to it the same way you'd hold yourself to any other real deadline in your life. Fifth, open or max out an HSA if you have access to one through your employer or your insurance plan, because every year you delay is a year of tax-free growth you don't get back. And sixth, pull your Social Security statement this month. Actually look at the numbers for claiming at 62, 67, and 70, and let that inform how you think about your other savings instead of treating Social Security as a mystery you'll figure out later. None of these 6 things require a windfall. They require a decision made now while the 20-year runway is still fully intact. That's really what this whole video comes down to. 45 isn't the age where it's too late. It's the age where the decision still changes everything, if you make it on purpose instead of by accident. If you found this helpful, I'd genuinely love it if you subscribed, because next time we're covering something that surprised even me when I researched it: the retirement rule almost every study contradicts, and why so many people are still following it anyway. I'll see you in that one.